This SoCal Sound Session is sponsored by Whitmore Law, dedicated to supporting and assisting performers, songwriters, producers, composers, and all music professionals in every endeavor.
Hey, it's Matt Pinfield. We are here at the SoCal Sound, and I'm really excited to be hanging out with Amythyst Kiah right now. She's got a new record, Still and Bright. Hey, it's good to see you.
Hey, it's great to see you too. Yeah, it's an honor to meet you. I grew up watching you on MTV, so this is really an honor. So yeah.
That means the world to me, I gotta tell you. It's really cool because I'm a fan of your music and I love, it's so soulful and powerful. And for me, that's really cool because I love it because it's so real,
Yeah.
Hearing you perform songs and just your delivery and your voice, it's amazing. I gotta talk to you too about, so you grew up in Tennessee, right? I mean, I know that.
Yeah, I'm in Northeast Tennessee. I live in Johnson City, an hour and a half north of Dollywood, Gatlinburg.
Yeah.
So yeah, up there.
That's cool though. You started, your dad was into music too, right? Like he was.
Yeah. He for a while he lead sang and played hand percussion in a band. And they played a lot around Johnson City, college parties. They would go up to the ski resort in Beach Mountain and play places up there. So it was, and they did the top 40s of the time. So it was Allman Brothers, Earth, Wind and Fire, Carlos Santana.
Cool 70s
people
stuff.
No one's ever heard of.
Yeah.
He just obviously loved music. He's a big audiophile. He had three-way. So pretty much every morning, I would hear some of the best music coming through three-way speakers, and
wow.
He had an integrated amplifier and all that stuff. And yeah, so he's just always been a big music guy. And so he's definitely been he's been so supportive of me over the years. He used to go out on the road with me and drive and sell merch and so he's just been such a really supportive, just amazing person.
How cool is that?
So,
I love the fact that he go out on the road with his daughter and just spend time. That's really cool.
Yeah.
And when I hear about that, I see these relationships with people in bands that I love that have had with their parents or a parent, who's been there, who just really cares. And it's just you can't. Yeah. It's an amazing thing,
Yeah, and I know with us also there was some moments in time where it was a little complex because my dad, he had dealt with substance abuse and. He had gotten clean and was recognized that part of the problems that I was having really stemmed from the decisions he made, and this was his opportunity to be okay, I gotta get clean because I need to support my daughter. She's got a shot to really make something of this really raw talent and I have to be there for her. And so he really dedicated his time. And so during the times where he was helping me, it was weird because it was I still hadn't fully forgiven for what had happened, or for him having that issue. But even though I would still have these instances of being, I don't know, I was kind of stuck in this mindset of being an angry teenager. My emotional maturity in my 20s was just kind of ended up matching, the age in which, my mom had committed suicide because my parents both the family kind of broke down. I grew up in, suburbia and had all of the things that a kid could want, but, my parents, the relationship just, kind of started to fall apart. And the way my dad decided to cope was he used substances, unfortunately. And so, and he's such an amazing man, and just kind of to show somebody that is such a good person that always tries to do the right thing can still be susceptible. And also I didn't understand at the time what addiction actually does to your brain. It really literally changes you. So for me, my story and the story of my dad, for me, I see him as a hero because even though he fell, from grace, he still got up and still tried again. And that's one of the biggest things I've always learned from him is that no matter how bad things might seem, if you just hang on for the next day and just try again. And so that's one of the biggest lessons I've learned from him. And I also appreciate the fact that even though I wasn't always as grateful for his help because I was still dealing with those emotions, he still saw that and still helped me anyway, even though I was frustrating to deal with. I wasn't, I could be kind of difficult because of my own anxiety. So, and that is having that kind of support, that even when you're seemingly ungrateful and the person is still gonna stick around because it's like, I see why this person's responding, and I need to still be there to be the light, because if I'm not the light, I don't know who else is gonna be,
Yeah.
So anyway, I didn't realize I was gonna get that far into that,
I mean,
but it's such an important part of having support in a industry where, if you're trying to be, making a living making art and creating, is something that people enjoy, but it has a tendency to be like really undervalued in so many ways. And so to have people in your corner that aren't just seeing dollar signs on you, but actually like see like who you are, the things that you're struggling with, and is there to be supportive and encouraging. And like that's, I think, the downfall of a lot of like artists, that like they have a bunch of yes people around them. They have, and so that's, to me, like having that support is just so important. And it's, again, I think that was such a huge part of, how I've been able to get to where I am today, is because I had at least that one person that believed in me. And also, the faculty and staff and the people at, East Tennessee State University, that's the school I went to. That's where I learned how to perform and, all of the things I needed the tools I needed to be a recording artist, a touring musician. So I just had that structural support, and then that moral support from family that really made the difference. So I can't harp on that enough, how important that is.
I think it's great, as a guy who's in recovery himself and has 2 daughters, so I understand the dynamic, you know what I mean? And, and it's definitely improved things, but, there's a lot of residual things because of the history. You know what I mean?
That emotional baggage. You're like, I forgive you, but you still, the body hasn't quite let go of what happened. And so the subconscious has to catch up with, and that comes with, like, for me, like, meditation and like developing like a spiritual practice has been incredibly helpful to get through that. I think one thing that's super important for good human well-being is to have some sense of faith in something. That's how we thrive as humans. Like the narratives that we share that give us empowerment and hope and a sense of community, like that's such an important part of the fabric of the social of us as social animals. And when there's the lacking of faith, and it doesn't matter which faith, but having faith in something that's larger than yourself, understanding that, you're one part of like an entire, our relationship with the planet and the universe, it's symbiotic, It's like the idea of as above, so below. Like, it's not a wonder that, like the veins in our arms match, like, veins in like leaves, and like we're all connected. And so like I've been reading a lot of Alan Watts, rereading some of his stuff. So like I'm like, and like revisiting the Tao Te Ching, and like Zen Buddhism practices. I've kind of come back to those things because when I stopped practicing those things and just kind of focused on, okay, I need to do this interview, I need to get this outfit, and everything became very external, and I didn't check in with myself. So anyway, keeping that in perspective too, having a sense of faith in something that encourages light and love and compassion, I think is super helpful. And you're never going to be perfect, right? I mean,
no, he is still work in progress, always. Just the other day, like without thinking, I threw a bird at somebody that totally cut me off in traffic. And was that the greatest idea? Absolutely not, because that person could pull a gun on me. Yeah. But we're not always perfect, but it's a matter of like seeing that you've done something that's stupid and being like, okay, I gotta check myself, So it's just about holding yourself accountable and just trying to be as aware as you can, So, I think it's a great philosophy. It's very important too. And I just, because that's the one thing about being positive and shining a light and just bringing, because there's enough negativity out there, and it's also a way to keep yourself in check, right? Because if you believe there's something bigger than yourself, whatever that is, So
and if the bigger than yourself is not telling you to like go, murder people that don't believe believe you, or try to impose laws that to take away certain
people's rights
from you.
it's like
let's like try to have a conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway,
exactly. I agree with you 100% there.
Yeah.
You know, it's I really feel that this new record, it was just great. I mean, just straight down to the title. Tell me how you came up with the title for the record, because it kind of comes from what you just talked about.
Yeah. Still and Bright was inspired by rereading the Tao Te Ching, which is was written by a mysterious man named Lao Tzu back in I can't remember the year now, but 1,000 years ago at least, or if not 2,000 years ago. So it's very old ancient wisdom. But essentially the idea is that. And I feel like Alan Watts does a great job of explaining Eastern religion to a Western brain, because it's hard to wrap your head around. This idea that, in the Western world, we are taught to cultivate our ego and how we're going to present to the world and how we're going to, fit in society, what our role is in society. And a lot of time, it's up, to the parents to guide and tell what to do in order to, be a good consumer, work for a company, or whatever. And it's the problem is if all of your decisions come from this external thing, and Alan Watts makes a really interesting point that we live in a in a republic. I know a lot of people, we call it we kind of use republic and democracy interchangeably, but the idea is that we're talking about democratic principles, or at least the idea of we all have a chance to have our voice heard and all of these things. But then the religion that's used to try to also, that you also have to live with, is one that's hierarchical, there's God, and then there's, all of these different levels. And so you kind of have a monarchical God, but then you're supposed to be living in this free society, and making those two things make sense is kind of hard, which is, I think, why there's a lot of cognitive dissonance. So the thing about Taoism is that, or looking at, non-duality, that's represented in the yin yang, the idea is that you're able to reconnect with nature, to be able to reconnect with, who you are outside of all of the titles that you are told that you have to choose from, and the kind of car you're supposed to buy and the kind of house you're supposed to be in. So it's this breaking away of acquiring materials to then say, this is my life, this is who I am. I mean, and I think of Fight Club, the guy who's ooh, I'm getting my IKEA furniture today. His whole life is about what's the next thing I can buy, and I think with ideas with the ideas that are presented in Taoism, it allows for people to be in the present and to realize that there's only now, and that, when we drag the past with us, if we drag the past with us, if we think too much or worry too much about the future, then we spend our whole life kind of in limbo. And then while we're doing that, we're, stuffing our faces with food or doom scrolling or whatever. And, while playing food and entertainment is fun, when we start to use that for an escape, when it's all we have is okay, we go to the job we don't like, and then we have to, numb ourselves with all these other things. And it's at what point are you taking time to have a still moment where you're looking within? And it's scary the longer you repress those things, when it is time to sit down and be still, my whole thing was I wanted to be able to sit alone with my thoughts and not spiral. That's been my whole goal, and a lot of us do that. And so the moment you can be still and sit with that silence, that's where brightness can come from, is by being still and trying to work through those things that you've been repressing through Western conventions. So, wow, that's okay. It's funny because I wasn't sure if I was gonna explain this and even make sense, but I feel was that a decent explanation of what I was trying to get at, I think?
Yeah, it was. It absolutely was.
All right.
Cool. I've got to talk about the songs on the album too, and the friends that you work with on the record. Play God and Destroy the World from the first song. Tell me about this from Kentucky, S.G. Goodman, who you ended up working with on that song.
Yeah, well, she's, we were trying to get together to do co-writes, for the record, but we couldn't quite make the timing work. But felt the next best thing would be, to have her maybe come sing on one of the songs. And I felt like this song in particular would be really fun to have her sing on. Yeah, she came over to Butch's studio. We had already like put down all the rhythm tracks and everything. All we really needed now was just her vocal. So she drove over from Kentucky and came by the studio and hung out for a little bit, and then laid down the vocals. And yeah, it was awesome. She just did a killer job, and just like really like sweet, down to earth person. And it was cool. It was my first time like meeting her in person, so it had only been through like text message and emails and whatnot. So yeah, but it was incredible. She just did a killer job, and yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, you worked on the last record. You worked with Tony Bergen. Now, of course, on this record, our mutual friend who I love, Butch Walker, just a great producer, great songwriter, great human being. Mm-hmm. He's in his own level of songwriting, but just and of course all the people he's worked with. But you guys really hit it off. And ended up having him produce the whole record. Yeah. Let's talk about the song that you guys did together, Silken Petals. Can you talk to me about that song in particular?
Yeah, Silken Petals. So it's inspired by a story. It was like a Mike Flanagan show called The Haunting of Bly Manor. And it's the story of the lady in the lake. She was at one point the lady of the manor, but she now lives in the lake, and she's a ghost and haunts, and basically like haunts the property. And the story is that she falls ill, and her sister, and she falls ill and passes away, but she wants to leave this chest of silken petals to her daughter so she could be the next lady of the manor. Well, after she passed, the issue was that there wasn't enough money to keep the manor going. So the sister was like, well, we should just sell this chest of like treasure, essentially, so we can like, get out of here. And the husband agreed. And she goes to open the chest, and the hands of the woman come out, and she basically like strangles her sister to death. And then the husband finds the sister, and he's like, this box is cursed. So he throws it in the lake, and him and his daughter leave never to return. And, in this act of betrayal, she can't find peace in the afterlife. So every night she wanders the property, walks through the house looking for her daughter. And unfortunately, many other families had moved into the house over many decades, and a lot of them met their demise, because if you were in her path, she would just immediately she would strangle you. And so what ended up happening is the babysitter, I can't remember the characters' names right now, but the main character, the babysitter, she ends up absorbing the ghost to kind of making her think, because she at this point her memory's faded, she's blind, she doesn't even know why she's even doing what she's doing. So she thinks that the babysitter is her daughter. So the babysitter absorbs the ghost into her, and then she and the gardener escape and then have a whole life together. But as years go by, the ghost slowly starts taking over her body. And at one night, she's laying next to her partner, and she almost kills her, because at this point, the ghost is fully about to take over. So she leaves in the middle of the night and goes back to the manor and drowns herself in the lake to protect the one that she loves. And at the end, the partner that was left behind, she sits in a chair and has the door open, and you see a hand go on her shoulder. So it's the idea is insinuates that she comes to visit her every night. And I just the parallels and the intertwining of death and grief and loss and love, and how that all manifests in different ways, and how these two characters had actually so much in common, because they both in a way sacrificed themselves to try and help the one that they loved. And so yeah, and somehow she was able to give the ghost that, even though the consequences were obviously dire. But so that just really inspired me to write this song. But I also at the same time was trying to experiment with writing more upbeat songs. And I thought, well, this is a really, really sad story. So the juxtaposition of it being more of like an upbeat, like dance, rock kind of vibe, just felt it was just a fun experiment to kind of play with that, and yeah. And then Butch, did the guest vocals on it and did a duet thing, so it was cool. And he came down on Americana Fest when I did my showcase at the Cannery. I texted him the day before and I was like, hey, like no big deal, but like if you're around, like if you want to come up and sing, he's like, yeah, like what time, So it was cool, and so he came and did that, and that was such a killer thing. Love singing with him too, so.
It came out great. It was really good. Talk about Billy Strings. Were you guys friends before he did the duet on the record?
We hadn't really hung out or anything before. I know over the years, like we had contact. We kind of gone back and forth a couple of times about getting together, hanging out, but like nothing ever. We just schedules and stuff. So, but I'd always wanted to do some sort of collab with him at some point, but just waiting for the right song and the right time. And with this song, I Will Not Go Down, it was inspired by, like hero's journey stories. It was also inspired by, it started with a poem that I wrote in like my high school journal like years back, and I came across it like a couple years ago, and I'd written the first verse of the song is a poem that I'd written after I had learned about, the Crusades in Europe back in like the medieval times or something like that. And at that time I had been thinking a lot about how like the hypocrisy of like being in a spiritual position and like deciding that, oh yeah, killing and murdering other people that don't believe us is like, that's somehow the right path to go. It has nothing to do with any sort of spiritual journey. It's taking advantage of people basically.
Absolutely.
So I wrote this poem, and then, like I said, found it years later, like a couple years ago. And then I was like, well, I kind of would like to finish the song. And the musically, I was kind of inspired by a lot of like the symphonic metal that I also grew up listening to, like Evanescence and Nightwish and Epica, and they always had like this very sort of like get on the horse and like go off to battle. I kind of wanted to incorporate that kind of sound, but we also didn't want to go like obviously like full metal because like that's not that's not. We want to try new things, but I don't want to like totally like alienate my audience. I'm required. So I was like, well, bluegrass is the metal folk music, so we can just make this just as epic, but just obviously with acoustic instruments. And then I was like, this felt like a good time for Billy Strings to be like lay something down. He seemed like perfect for it. Also, a person being familiar with like metal and stuff.
Yeah.
Because like I saw a video where he was like sitting in at one of Tool's concerts playing electric guitar, and it's like this guy's like doing it all, So
hanging out playing with like with Danny and Maynard and those guys, right? And Adam, I love. That was cool. It's amazing how many people cross over and like different styles of music and stuff.
It's fun. It's like I think it's great. I just think because at the beginning of the commercial music industry, it was very much like, it started out being segregated, race records and hillbilly records.
Yeah.
And then that pattern of just like trying to just, applying marketing to art, like it's a fine line between getting the word out there but then also like manufacturing like a category that then puts people in a position to like gatekeep and basically determine what something is as if other people's ideas or opinions matter, So it's a marketing tool, I get it, but also it's obviously, used in the wrong way can lead to, really just underestimating how eclectic people's music tastes can be, So yeah, I forget where I was going with that.
You're right, though. I think it's interesting. You're talking about the different things you've seen that Billy Strings would do, and I think that's cool to people. And I had no idea you love symphonic metal, but I love that too because it shows the diversity of what you liked as a kid. So you were like so many other people where
I listened to a lot of new metal in high school.
Yeah.
Like Queen of the Damned was like my favorite movie. I had the soundtrack and like listened to Static X and Korn and all those folks. Yeah,
all those bands that were on my TV show Farm Club. You know what I mean? Like everybody played like.
I mean a lot of it. I watch a lot of MTV, and that was my jam.
Yeah.
It was cool.
It was cool, and it's so great for a lot of those guys that they're having a resurgence in a big way. So I'm very happy for them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because we've been friends for so long, which is great. So Empire of Love. Let's talk about that song too, because that's early in the record, and it's a song that is really strong that I heard you do live. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, so Empire of Love, I co-wrote that one with Sean McConnell. He's a fantastic songwriter in Nashville. Really loved working with him on this. Initially, the inspiration for the song started when I was back home from tour, and I was at one of my favorite parks that I like to walk in, and it was about this time of year, so there was the fall foliage. I mean, it's amazing to not have to go to Vermont or something to see the beautiful fall foliage, because we got it right here, or foliage, because we have it right in East Tennessee. But anyway, I was walking and I was just kind of taking pictures, and I really was I took this picture of a bunch of dead leaves with orange and yellow and all of those colors, and I had a moment where I was like, I get to live here, this is home. And I just, for so many years, I kind of, always felt a little bit like a misfit, in Appalachia for various reasons. And it was the first time I had really had that moment of damn, this is where I live, And then I was like, well, I kind of want to write a song to sort of commemorate that. And one of the reasons why it was kind of felt difficult sometimes, or I felt out of place in Appalachia, just because we're in the Bible Belt, and I have I'm a big anti-dogma advocate. I don't like the idea of people passing judgment in a way in the name of a God. I really had a problem with that. It's already bad enough if someone is like that and they're not using God as their smokescreen, but there's something worse about that, using something that's supposed to be, showing people light and compassion, and using that to just, be hateful, and that really was something that always bothered me. So, but as I got older and I traveled and played shows and went to different places, it all just kind of dawned on me that I live in a community where I can be myself. I can have, be in a same-sex relationship. I can have a sense of community and like-mindedness with people and still live in Appalachia. And so it's this idea that we should be able to live in the places that we shouldn't have to escape where we live in order to be ourselves. And so the song's a celebration of being able to find myself and my sense of self, and kind of I guess reclaiming the place, not as I'm an outsider, but I'm just as a part of this as anybody else that lives here. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's very cool that it has that subject matter, because it's important. Yeah, because it's a shame when people have had to leave and escape places because they're not. People don't have open minds, or not accepting. You know what I mean, and welcoming. So that's cool. Yeah. I love that you did that. What I've been meaning. I wanted to ask you, because I knew you like all kinds of music. I love when you covered "Love Will Tear Us Apart." Can we talk about the Joy Division, because that was super cool. I know. I wanted. For me, it was just important to find out how much you love that song, or the reason behind it.
Yeah, well, I listened to a lot of stuff in high school, but one of the things I never actually got around to listening to Joy Division as much, just because sometimes I would get locked in on a few artists and just obsess about them. I was recording a live performance in conjunction with Gibson Guitars and Rolling Stone to perform a song on the 500 greatest songs of all time list that they updated. And my manager, Dolph Ramser, he was like, I think you could do a really amazing, slowed down, acoustic version of Love Will Tear Us Apart. And I was like, I've not gotten around to really sitting down and listening to Joy Division. This is a great time to do that, It's always open to suggestions about stuff. And I heard the song, I was reading the lyrics, and I'm like, this is if you just read the lyrics, it's like a country song.
Yeah, yeah.
It's You know, it's like my wife's about to leave me. But the thing is like, it's what was so beautiful. I don't know. Beautiful is a weird word to use for this, I guess. But I think what was so beautifully illustrated in the song, it talked about the time before you break up. Like, whereas sometimes songs will talk about, like, you know, being resentful or, like, you know, scratching the side of that four-wheel drive. Love that song. But this was about, like, the moments before, like when you're laying in bed and your back's to the other person and you both know that this is over, but both of you, like, you can't move, you don't know how to even start that conversation. And I was just like, that is such a painful part for both parties, you know?
Yes.
And it really kind of showed, like, you know, I love that it wasn't like, you know, it was like, you know, oh, well, you did me wrong. And, like, you know, it was very much like, hey, we're both at the end of our ropes. And, you know, sometimes things just don't work, you know? It's not always like, it's your fault or it's my fault. Like, sometimes it's just, hey, it's not working. And that can almost be almost as painful, because at least if someone's, like, actually, like, harming you, or it's at least there's, like, you know, at least it can be a thing of a very obvious reason of, like, hey, this person's being awful. But if the person's, like, actually maybe not awful, it's just things aren't working, like, it's almost worse in a way. So, and making that into, like, this, like, killer post-punk, like, kind of dance song, which I think, now that I'm talking about this, I think that might have also been probably inspired the Silk and Petals, like, the way that I approach that, you know, because you have this, like, upbeat thing and you listen to the lyrics, like, oh my God, this is such a sad story.
Yeah.
Not all stories have happy endings necessarily, you know? So anyway, I just fell in love with the story of the song, and then ended up recording that live cover. And actually that live performance that I did for that particular project, like, that's like the recording that we used on that EP. So anyway.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think it's cool. And you also liked it when you did the updated version of Natural Blues with Moby too, which I thought was very
so cool.
Tell me how that came about.
Yeah, well, you know, like, several years ago, I recorded the song under the original, like, Smithsonian Folkways title, "Trouble So Hard."
Yeah.
I learned that song on my own to perform at my solo shows when I was playing, like, solo around the region, and I did, like, you know, I, like, came up with this, like, fingerstyle guitar arrangement to go under it. And then I, like, recorded it in, like, 2015 with a backing band I played with back home. And he apparently heard that recording. And, you know, and it had been years since I'd put it out. So, like, you never know when someone's going to hear something. But he had reached out and he was like, hey, I'm doing this, you know, this reprise album. Would love to have your vocals on it. And I was like, wow, this is crazy. So I came in, it was like early 2020, like January 2020, because this was like, I actually was coming in to attend the Grammys. And so there was a couple of days where I just stayed at his guest house, and, you know, we went in the studio. We weren't in the studio for, like, literally, I did, like, 3 vocal takes, and he's like, all right, we got it, you know? Like, he was just very, like, you know, let's do it, which I think is really fascinating. It's almost like allowing spontaneity to happen.
Yeah.
Kind of going back to, like, you know, living in the present. So I really, like, appreciated, like, you know, that, I don't know, his approach was really, really fascinating. Like, not overthinking too much. So yeah, and then I think later on, a couple years later, I came back to LA and we shot, like, these European TV show videos for that song with Gregory Porter. So I got a chance to meet Gregory Porter in person, and then we filmed that. I forget, there was, like, this hippie ranch up in the hills. I can't remember which part of LA it was, or how many of those things exist up in the hills. So I might not be narrowing anything down, but it was one of those kind of spots, and it was cool. So, but yeah, he was awesome to work with. It was cool.
That was amazing. That's so great.
We talked about the Lomax archives, and, like, it was cool to hear him, you know.
It's amazing. He's really he's just such a smart guy.
Yeah.
We met the first time because he took a train down to the club I was DJing at, because a friend of his told him, hey, you know what, this guy's really cool. That if you want to do something there. But we had no PA because he wanted to start playing. It was before his first single, Go, and Drop a Beat, like the early stuff.
Yeah.
So, but he came and hung out for the night, which was so cool.
That's
so
awesome.
It's like before he got on a train back to New York.
Yeah.
And it's a long story, but I always loved that, and I'm so glad when you did that. And one of the last questions I want to ask you, too, about the record with Avi Kaplan from Pentatonics, which is really cool that you do the song together. Tell me about how that came about.
What's funny is, like, I learned about Avi Kaplan through his solo record Floating on a Dream, produced by Shooter Jennings. That's how I learned about him. I didn't even know about the Pentatonics thing. But then I realized, well, that makes complete sense because I was completely wowed by his vocal range as clearly as a bass vocalist, and his range, his falsetto, like the lows that he can get, just like was just so awesome and really inspiring as a vocalist to hear that breadth of and it kind of also encouraged me to like explore my lower register. I actually ended up starting after years of being told I should do this and not doing it. I started like doing vocal exercises to like kind of expand my range and stuff. And so it was like, and hearing that record was just sort of like, okay, this is really cool. And then it made me start thinking about like, well, what else could I do with my voice, So it was a very inspiring record, and loved the production, how it was done.
Shooter does a great job. Shooter's cool. He's got that studio now where like, over near where they did Pet Sounds and all that.
Oh, yeah.
Wrecking Crew stuff, which is cool, Yeah,
it's awesome. Yeah, so like, so then I shot him a message, and I'm like, oh my God. And so that's when I learned he was like, oh, he's in the Pentatonics. And I'm like, oh man, he might be too busy to even like want to bother talking to me. I don't know. But I sent the message, and I don't normally like send stuff out because I've always, I don't know, just a mental hang up in my head. But I went for it, and he like responded the same day. And he was like, thanks so much for messaging. He's like, I'm really bad at like not reaching out to people too. I feel like we should do that more often, And so it was cool. We had like that moment of like, I'm not the only one that like, overthinks reaching out to people. And so then we met up with him and Jeremy Latito, and we wrote a song. And we wrote Die Slowly Without Complaint together, which was inspired by the Old Gods of Appalachia show. So we did that. And then I was like, I'd love to have his vocals on, Gods Under the Mountain, having that low bass vocal. And then also there was another track that we did that didn't make the record because it was so different. It was called Galaxy Brain, and musically I was inspired by like classical ragas and also meditation music.
Yeah.
So I like play in like Daggad, and like it's very much like. It's like a cheap imitation of a raga with like kind of sounding a little bit like Jeff Buckley, So it's like off-brand raga Daggad with like, and like almost like in a very Jeff Buckley-esque kind of build-up kind of thing. And he like did vocals for that. So he did like some crazy like Inuit. He did some sort of like Inuit vocal thing. I forget what he said. It was from like it was a certain style of folk singing that was like crazy. We're gonna release that at some point because it's I really want people to hear it. But it was so different. It was like its own standalone track. So hopefully we'll have that out at some point in the future. But anyway, it was so cool to work with him and like sing with him. That was the other thing, was like be able to sing, and it was super dope. But he's a super nice guy too. So. Yeah, it's fun.
That's great. I mean, so, I just want to say it was so great to have you come in, and thanks for performing, hanging out with us.
Hopefully you got all your questions in. I tend to get on a roll talking about stuff, so I hope you got all your questions in.
No, I appreciate it. I really enjoyed hanging out with you today.
Yeah,
it was a total hang.
Yeah,
it was
totally
cool.
Was, yeah.
I
love that.
Yeah. So thanks so much for coming by the SoCal Sound and hanging out with me. And I look forward to seeing you on the road. Yeah. It was great. You got it. Thanks. So it's Amythyst Kiah right here on the SoCal Sound. I'm Matt Pinfield. Thanks for watching and listening.